black man want ownership. He want to be able to own his own things and make up his own mind.
Criminal ethic, that street corner value system, it's overpowering.
Never no less than 50,000 just in a day.
Damn, we got all the $100 bills in America.
Black power was for equality for African Americans. Black gangsters, they're destroying the community.
The death wish that it's still possible to go out here and sell some cocaine and buy a Cadillac.
The Jews, the Irish. I mean, it's every group in America has attempted to go to the next level economically. The story of organized crime and narcotics has played a part in it.
We had indicted Frank, and our indictment included about 20 foreign defendants, Venezuelan customs agents, and Jules Serini, the courier who came from Marseilles with 22 kilos of heroin. Miller and I were requested to report to the criminal division immediately for a meeting with the CIA. There are international ramifications as to things we're doing in Venezuela and with the Russians that we can't talk about. And you will have your indictment dismissed in federal court. Need I say more? And we said, we understand, and they said, have a nice day.
So just why was the Central Intelligence Agency intervening in a drug conspiracy case that revolved around a 29-year-old black man operating out of Brooklyn? The Frank Matthews case gives us a powerful and disturbing glance into the economic state of urban black America circa 1970.
We must realize that something has been happening economically in our country. People are on the move. The population is shifting.
I've always heard that Negroes buy shoddy, poor-quality merchandise.
No, it's just the other way around. According to leading researchers, in proportion to population and income, Negroes buy more quality products than any other comparable United States group. Per capita, they buy more cosmetics, drugs, and toiletries than anyone else in the country.
Like the Italians, Irish, and Jewish families that made their fortune during Prohibition, including the crooked Kennedys, a handful of black gangsters and their families went from rags to riches seemingly overnight. But it was a wild and violent ride. White powder, black power is the story of how the illegal drug economy was the first truly large and widespread capital-building tool for African Americans, all made possible by political decisions in Washington, D.C. and its CIA headquarters. With more money, more murders than even the Prohibition gangster era, and with long-lasting consequences that haunt our urban landscapes to this day. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times for black America. In 1959, nearly 60% of blacks lived in poverty. 10 years later, that figure was down to 32%. But while it was the white people fleeing the cities because of crime, decay, and industrial decline, it was black people actually suffering from the rapid growth of crime in the late 60s. The riots across the country, from Watts to Harlem, sped up this process and left a lawless urban landscape ripe for the pickings of a new breed of criminal, the drug kingpin.
Historically, heroin had been in the black communities way back in the early days.
We as Americans always want to be very romantic about things. This is about capitalism, and this is about a type of capitalism that many poor blacks could not go anywhere but to.
As I talked about in Cold War Heroin Heat, the increased drug supply was a direct result of the American government's decision to protect French, Italian, and Chinese drug dealers as they flooded the streets of black America with illegal drugs for political reasons.
61, 62, when it started getting real popular. And then around 1964, 65, it was really growing. It was booming, like, you know.
In Harlem, which was ground zero of the heroin epidemic thanks to the Italian mafia, a shocking 20%, 1 in 5 of black men were injecting heroin with needles on a daily basis circa 1970.
3 of the biggest drug kingpins in the United States at that time were black: Frank Lucas, Leslie Atkinson, and Frank Pee Wee Matthews. Extremely intelligent. They were not given the education opportunities that the whites had.
It was a poor community. We lived in poor housing. From that poor housing, we went to poor schools, received a poor education, and that poor education sent us on poor-paying jobs. It returned us right back into the poor community.
Paid you, what, $1.55 an hour. You know, here, the only job you're gonna get, wash these dishes. You know, a lot of disrespect, and I wasn't having that. And the only other way I knew to earn that type of money was in narcotics.
With Vietnam and the introduction of LSD and the return of the soldiers from Vietnam, the drug scene kind of proliferated.
Every man leaving South Vietnam now is tested for heroin addiction.
New York City was ground zero. 1 out of 5 men in Harlem were injecting heroin on a daily basis, and a rogues gallery of Cuban, Puerto Rican, and black dealers fed the streets with the heroin and cocaine they got from their Italian suppliers, or, increasingly, that they got themselves directly. New connects, new sources of supply were appearing every day, as the drug business had become an important part of the American economy.
The interesting thing is I toured the nation. I saw those same types of men in many cities, whether it was Philadelphia or Baltimore or Washington, D.C. They were the ones that would go to the little private parties after a concert, and those men were an elite group.
There's an old saying in the streets: there's no business like blow business. In 1970, $500 of Turkish morphine base turned into a $5,000 kilo of heroin in Marseilles, France, which turned into a $20,000 kilo in New York, which could turn into as much as $1 million by the time it went into a junkie's veins. The poppy plant is the mother of the world's highest profit margin commodity.
This is right before Watergate. The president called all of us down to the White House for a meeting on his drug abuse plan. He was livid with rage when I told him what was going on in Brooklyn. But the violence in Brooklyn at the time, Miami, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and Atlanta, similar information was coming back. Some guy named Matthews was behind the local organizations in those cities. That he was tired of paying huge amounts of money to the La Cosa Nostra, and a group of Jewish businessmen in Brooklyn were distributing heroin.
You know, later I went to the hard narcotics smuggling section of customs. That's when I started getting a little bit of an education and understanding that all the heroin was coming from Italian sources, Jewish too.
In 1959, the criminal landscape of America changed drastically. After mob boss Vito Genovese was sent to prison for heroin conspiracy, the mafia decided to get out of heroin, which really meant they would simply import the drug with the help of their CIA connections in Europe and let non-family members like the Jewish Herbie Sperling middleman the drug to black and Latino dealers. The biggest middleman of all was Lou Cirillo, the mafia's point man when they decided to get back in the business around 1970. Before Frank Matthews got his own Corsican source, Lou Cirillo supplied him, along with most of New York's biggest dealers. Something went wrong for the mafia in 1972, though, something big. So big that the boss of the Lucchese family, Tommy Ryan Eboli, was executed in Crown Heights, Brooklyn on the orders of the Mafia Commission.
The basic issue for us is self-determination. It's to be able to live in America with some degree of dignity. It's to have some control over our own destiny. We don't want welfare, colonialism in the black ghetto. We don't want white business to come in and say, well, we're going to do you a favor today. We're going to give you 300 jobs. The basic issue has to do with whether or not we can control some employment for ourselves. And that means we've got to have some kind of selective patronage. We've got to control businesses in black communities.
So the mafia heroin business was in disarray and the French Connection was over. In this power vacuum, kingpins like Frank Matthews and Eddie Jackson became some of the richest black men in America almost overnight. Here's an interesting fact. When Norris Herndon, heir to the Atlanta Life Insurance Company and reputedly the richest black man in America, died in 1977, he was worth $23 million. I know for a fact that dealers like Nicky Barnes in New York and Eddie Jackson in Detroit were profiting up to $1 million a month at that time.
And Frank Matthews at that time, I think, was probably under 30 years old, was extremely bright, had good leadership skills, and had convened a meeting of all the top African-American and Hispanic drug dealers in Atlanta, Georgia, in 1971. And his goal was to unite and form a family where they cut out the Italian mafia and went right to the source of heroin and brought it in and controlled the distribution.
He put $4 million on the table at one time. And he bragged about this. And he says, let me see if you can match this. And nobody could at the time. And he bought heroin or cocaine.
Detective Garay's story here seems to dovetail in with a story from a federal informant. In early 1971, the informant said he went to a brownstone in Brooklyn to chip in on a heroin purchase that Elwood Bynum and Frank Matthews were organizing with their Corsican partners in France. The informant said the entire brownstone was full of cash, millions of dollars in small bills, a massive load of 400 kilos fresh from the labs in Marseilles, costing probably $4 million wholesale and worth $250 million when it hit the streets, was in the works. Believe it or not, the heroin was smuggled across the Atlantic from France to New York using underwater mines, once used by the Nazis to protect the coastline from Allied invasion in World War II.
He had given $1 million to a friend to hold and disappeared again. So when the gentleman sees him again, he say, Frank, when you gonna come get that money? And Frank goes, what money? He said, yo, man, you remember you gave me the shopping bag, those shopping bags, that money? He said, I'll come get it in a week or so. So how much money does he have?
We interviewed some informants. We rushed through an indictment, the first indictment before the superseding indictments, and we had Matthews indicted.
Mr. Brown, we're wondering why you haven't sued or taken some other action. I think if these stories had been written about me, I would be denying them to the nth degree.
Well, we denied it already, and like I say, we have to let our lawyers handle it in a legal manner through the courts.
Courtney Brown Sr. didn't get involved in selling drugs until he was 30 years old. He was actually a steward for the Detroit City Bus Workers Union, which was probably the ceiling of achievement for most black males in America circa 1970, unless you got in the drug business.
He knew we're driving the bus and playing the union game where that was going to lead. And it would have eventually led to a nice house, maybe one day on the northwest side of Detroit, and a decent pension. The kind of money that Eddie was already making, it became obvious that if he got involved with him, that he was going to have an opportunity to set himself up and put his family in a whole different situation than very few will ever get to know. And that did happen.
Eddie would rank in the top 5 across the country, and from 71 all the way up to 75 till he got violated. I would say Frank Matthews, beyond a shadow of a doubt, was #1. There's only 2 or 3 people that Italians, black, were dealing with. Eddie was one, Frank Matthews.
With the introduction of drugs, large amounts of drugs into the United States came an economy, an underground economy.
A river of money is flowing because business is so good. Everybody knows everybody. You're turning your money like you're supposed to, or you're paying cash for what you're doing, you have a good life.
In 70, 71, heroin was endemic. Entire blocks in Brooklyn, the entire apartment houses were addicted, and small $10 packages of heroin was being used.
We had a mandate to go after these guys. So the politicians made a lot of noise, the media focused on that, which forced law enforcement to go after those guys that were dealing heroin.
And I decided to leave Compton Police Department and went with an agency called the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. I put in an application. I wanted to make a difference. I saw the country going to hell in a basket, to say. I saw people just destroying their lives. I saw heroin addicts.
Kids who their parents had struggled and marched and wanted to make sure that they were extremely successful and to go as far as their talents could take them, suddenly got involved in drugs. And the drug was heroin. So it was just destroying the African-American community.
In 1972, Agent Sutton, one of the DEA's first black undercover agents, was sent to Detroit. Agent Sutton arrived in a Detroit that was simultaneously the murder capital of the country and one of the most affluent metropolitan areas in the entire United States. For many African Americans, Detroit was truly the promised land of opportunity.
We had a lot of black lawyers, doctors, both male and females. They had black law firms here, and they had politicians.
To all dope pushers, to all rip-off artists, to all mothers, hit the road.
I saw a kind of a black influence that I had never seen in other cities like Los Angeles, Chicago, and places.
Some people in the black community, like Eddie Jackson in Detroit, were finding their economic empowerment through heroin.
Mr. Jackson, it's alleged that just 6 years ago you were earning a little better than $3 an hour as an auto production worker. Just how did you come to acquire this home in Southfield and your other business interests, your automobiles?
Well, I think the law states, that you have to file your income. If I tell you that, then you know my secret, But as long as I file my income, and I think this is what the law states, and I do that.
What he understood was people. He understood that this was Motown. It was an automotive city, that you work 5 days a week and that you should get 2 days off a week. And he understood that that's what people's perception of a job was. And back then, if Chrysler was paying me $300 a week, if I say, I'll pay you $600 a week for the same 40 hours of work. He understood that these guys would get that, right? So you'll pay me twice what the plant pays me, and I'll work the same 40 hours. And he just put it and organized in the early days when he was in the retail end of it. He just organized the retail operation just like they were working at the plant. And it really worked. My dad got up at 7 o'clock, 6 o'clock in the morning every day that I can remember, particularly when he was involved in the underworld.
You're under constant surveillance. There have been all kinds of stories about your alleged connections with the underworld drug market. What's your reaction, Mr. Jackson?
Well, as far as the connection, that's 100% false. And as far as the surveillance, I welcome, anybody who feel like they want to waste their time watching me, but then they can...
Again, the question, how could a man at the age of 29, who just 6 years ago was earning something like $6,000 a year, acquire so much in so short a time?
Well, I think you asked me before about I worked in the pool room. I want to straighten that out. I own the pool room. Also, the block proceeded to that, And from that and manipulating, and I just came, fortunately, and came up to this.
Yeah, I believe in 1973, Eddie Jackson paid more Michigan and federal taxes than Atlantic Richfield, maybe Mobil Oil or Shell Oil, and another Fortune 100 company.
Mr. Brown and Mr. Jackson have paid better than $450,000 in income tax. I think that's more than some of the corporations, Shell, Atlantic Richfield, and a few of the others. Now, for Mr. Leff, who's in charge of the task force to try this case in the newspaper and get the public sentiment against these two gentlemen, I think that's reprehensible.
We're ready to burn it all down or blow it up, if that's what it takes, and ourselves with it. We've had it with Whitey. We want ours now.
And what does Whitey have to say about violence, rioting, and looting?
Okay, so they've got a gripe. But I say these riots were started by juvenile delinquents so they could loot.
For how long can you expect Negroes to see how great it is to live in America on their television sets and in the movies without them seeing how different their own lives are?
The thing that bothers me about this whole situation is there are so many Negroes that hate the white people. That's not right. It's just as wrong as the white people hate the Negroes.
African-American parents, my parents, marched with Dr. King. And the drug guys were pushing heroines, but they're selling a substance that's gonna kill your child or your grandchild.
You know, the term drug pusher is such a ridiculous phrase. No one makes people use drugs. You know, I can't speak about Pookie and Ray Ray struggling to get $10. But from the world we came from, the last thing you needed or wanted was someone who never was involved in drugs to start using it. Try this, get involved in this. It just, you know, a lot of that is just propaganda, man.
Black power was for equality for African Americans. Black gangsters are committing illegal crimes. They're destroying the community. You really want to know who the heroes are. And the heroes are, I'd like to say, is my generation, the first generation of agents with DEA, and especially as African American agents who worked undercover. That's how you made your bones in the 70s.
I was sent here to do a police officer who apparently worked narcotics and had gone into the dope dealing business by the name of Marseilles.
Henry Marseilles was a Detroit narcotics officer who turned to the dark side and started selling dope himself. After his release from prison around 1960, he started getting dope from the Italians and quickly rose to the top of Detroit's drug business.
I was given money as a young man on Washington Boulevard by Henry Marseilles, and he gave me money for school. And that's what he said. The money wasn't for me to go and get clever in an Italian knit. He gave me that money and he said, and I expect for you to go and use this for school and nothing else.
In the summer of 1970, Henry Marseilles had decided to take over Detroit's drug business. He called a meeting of the city's top dealers and told them that he had secured a direct Asian source of supply and that he could guarantee 20 pounds a week of pure China white, enough to supply most of the city.
We always had the African Americans involved in the distribution of drugs throughout the inner cities. And in the 70s, it's when the African Americans were becoming more prominent in business. The drug dealers wanted to do the same thing. And it just made business sense from their perspective to cut out the middleman, which had been the Italian mafia, and go right to the source and import heroin and control the distribution.
With his chief hitman, Jimmy Moody, standing behind him, Marseilles proposed that each dealer put up $50,000 in advance and that he'd provide the dope and police protection. Not everybody was willing to work for Henry Marseilles, though. Angry words soon led to dead bodies on the street, and things quickly got out of control. A war between Marseilles' allies, known as the West Side 12, against dealers loyal to the Italian mafia known as the East Side 7 led to 200 dead bodies. Jimmy Moody himself supposedly killed 15 people between Christmas of 1970 and July of 1971. In April of 1972, Henry Marseilles died at home from kidney failure. On his deathbed, the head of the state of Michigan's Organized Crime Division, an old colleague of Marseilles from his days as a Detroit undercover narcotics cop, showed up and asked him to stop the drug war. Henry Marseilles did this by having his chief hitman, Jimmy Moody, killed. Moody was found in the trunk of his Eldorado at Detroit Metropolitan Airport.
The day I arrived in Detroit, I was shown two bodies that had been placed inside of the trunk of cars at the Detroit Metropolitan Airport. And the stench, the bodies were decomposed and you could see the maggots.
With Henry Marseilles gone, John Sutton's next target was Denard Devil Jackson, a business partner of Courtney Brown Jr.'s father.
Within a day of arriving in Detroit, Marseilles died apparently of natural cause, and Devil Jackson had gotten shotgun in the face the night before. And there was some indication that the person that killed Devil Jackson was one of the informants that I would be working with.
Devil Jackson, being an old-timer guy who kind of knew his way around the streets, he sees that for whatever reason, this guy Eddie Jackson's the real thing, and this guy has gone from a nobody in the streets to the man in the streets in like 18 months.
Devil Jackson had been shotgunned in the face the day that John Sutton arrived in Detroit, possibly by the very confidential informant Sutton was supposed to be working with. So he turned his sights to other dealers, including Devil Jackson's protege, a man that had managed to stay out of Henry Marsette's war, Eddie Jackson. Early 1971, John Klassen, Eddie Jackson's supplier, was indicted in federal court and promptly disappeared. But Jackson and Courtney Brown kept their operation going until they made an even bigger connection in New York City.
I told you all that I was the greatest of all time.
So the plan is simple. Eddie will go out to New York, take his bankroll, take half his crew with him. Devil Jackson will introduce him to Goldfinger, some of the Cubans out there. He'll go back, get back in business.
Son, listen, I told you today, I'm still the greatest of all time.
So when Eddie's at the fight, of course, there's an iconic photo taken in the Ebony magazine where the famous picture of Frank Lucas from American Gangster fame when he's in his chinchilla. And also Eddie is photographed by the photographers of Ebony in conjunction with Devil Jackson, a guy named 5-0 Garrett, and his brother Elijah. The day before the fight, Eddie has a happenstance meeting with some members of the Gambino crime family. And, you know, the rest is kind of history. Eddie ends up doing business with the Gambino family for the next 10 years and makes, you know, phenomenal amounts of money.
Eddie Jackson crossed paths with the high-ranking member of the Gambino mafia family, the largest and most powerful in the country, who told him, quote, "It looks like we're in the same business." And indeed, they were.
After that, I was assigned investigations. I went out and worked on Eddie Jackson.
Once he bought that Rolls Royce and moved to Southfield and tore down the houses and rebuilt the houses, he was the target.
You're under constant surveillance. There have been all kinds of stories about your alleged connections with the underworld drug market. What's your reaction, Mr. Jackson?
Well, as far as the connection, that's 100% false. And as far as the surveillance, I welcome, you understand, anybody who feel like they want to waste their time watching me, you understand, well, then they can.
The authorities had leaked the indictment to the press. They had put our homes on the front page and...
Mr. Jackson, it's alleged that just 6 years ago you were earning a little better than $3 an hour as an auto production worker. Just how did you come to acquire this home in Southfield and your other business interests, your automobiles?
Well, I think the law states, you know, that you have to file your income. You know, if I tell you that, you know, then you know my secret, you know. But as long as I file my income, and I think this is what the law states, you know, and I do that.
Do you deny flatly that you were in any way tied in with the illegal drug trafficking?
Yes, I do.
Would you care to reveal just what your business holdings are, how you've acquired this wealth?
No, it is a matter of record. You know, if you want to check on that, you can check.
It's a matter of record. You're saying that you have property?
Yes, I do.
Mm-hmm. How did you acquire the property? Would you mind telling us that, sir?
If I tell you that, then you'll know my business.
Your family's house appears on the front page of the biggest newspapers in Detroit. You know, this was the biggest story in town for the summer of '73, and here we have Milton Henry, who was your father and Eddie's lawyer, kind of negating some of the stuff that was going on.
Now, on the other hand, we don't think the government can try this lawsuit anywhere but in a court. And that's all we've been saying, that they ought not to attempt to cast us into the news media and to a public trial in this unrestrained area of rumor, innuendo, suspicion, and all of that.
On just the surface, we were the quote-unquote black success story.
To get the story of this market, to be able to tell you the secret of selling the Negro, we did a lot of digging. We talked to leading businessmen, to customers, and to salesmen.
We're right next to Eddie's next to us. You got the Cadillac, you got Mercedes, you got another Cadillac, you got his crowd pleaser Rolls Royce.
Yeah, and he would throw money.
From reliable sources, guys that rode with him, it was nothing. If you caught him on the right day, he might throw $40,000, $50,000 out the window.
40, 50, in 1972, which is like $250,000 now.
Yeah. What is a safe assessment is that between 1969 to 1977, with only possible exception, Berry Gordy, Eddie Jackson was the richest black man in the state of Michigan. And the class of him and Berry Gordy and whoever was number 3, they were a long way down.
They were a distant third.
It was a distant third.
Well, Mr. Jackson has legitimate income on which he pays income tax. That's more than can be said for a whole lot of folks.
Let's talk about their lawyer. Who was Milton Henry?
Milton Henry, Malcolm X's, obviously the civil rights great leader.
He was Malcolm X's chief legal defense.
Chief legal defense and just confidant. If you read anything about like Malcolm's travels, like when Malcolm was poisoned in Africa, it was Milton Henry who drove him. Yale law degree, Yale divinity degree.
Probably one of the top 10 lawyers in the United States and certainly the top black lawyer in the United States.
Without question.
Over the weekend in Detroit, police and the members of the so-called Republic of Africa, a Negro separatist group, fought a gun battle inside and outside a church. A white policeman was killed, another was wounded, and 5 Negroes were injured.
An interesting side story that we will revisit is the interplay between the black militant movement and black drug kingpins. As we'll see later, there was a secret war going on in the streets. Black power meant different things to different people, and the money generated by selling white powder sometimes helped fund the cause.
A meeting of the Republic of New Africa, a militant Negro separatist organization, was in progress inside the church. Police said the men who shot the officers had taken refuge in the church and had continued firing outside. 4 people inside the meeting were wounded.
In Detroit, it seems like Eddie Jackson was smart enough to avoid this. His lawyer, Milton Henry, sat on the board of the Republic of New Africa, a black separatist group that wanted to seize control of the old Confederate states and make them a black homeland. When the Republic of New Africa got into a shootout inside of a Detroit church, Milton Henry was able to get the accused out on a personal bond from a black Detroit judge.
The judge said Cahalan's objections had racial overtones.
It's beyond me why he would inject the racial issue into this thing at all.
There is no racial overtone as far as you're concerned?
Oh, absolutely not.
Courtney Brown Jr. told me that his father and Eddie Jackson would occasionally receive phone calls from Milton Henry requesting a donation be made to the Republic. So Eddie Jackson would take 50 or 60,000 of the cash that he usually spent on European cars and South African diamonds and send it over to the cause of black separatism. Complicated times indeed.
The crime of murder is not unusual in this country, and nowhere is that more apparent than in Detroit, which has an unenviable record. Last year, more than 700 murders.
I immediately detected that there was something missing here, that there was a tremendous erosion of the political system and erosion of the police department, erosion of the religious system in the city. When I arrived in Detroit, I saw a kind of lawlessness that I never thought existed in any city. You know, you could easily be killed by being thought to be either the police or working for the police. One dope house I went into, I had a gun put in each ear, so you got to give up the Roscoe.
Whether it was Red Fox or the Temptations or the Dramatics or the OJs or whomever it might have been, or numerous other celebrities who came into town. Eddie might call him and say, hey, Berman, you know, that's what he called my dad, Berman, do me a favor, one of those Motown boys is big and they say they need us to do this or that for them. Can you please stop by? And if they had some vices or drugs of choice, Eddie was the guy to come to, A, because he used to give it to him for free. And then we lived next door to a lot of them. A lot of these guys were our neighbors. One Christmas, Eddie goes downstairs, Eddie Jr. goes downstairs and his dad and a multi-Grammy winning artist both had, you know, a bunch of white circles around their noses.
In January of 1972, just months before Motown Records left Detroit, Courtney Brown Jr.'s father was caught in the biggest heroin seizure in Michigan history, along with his boss, Eddie Jackson.
Eddie and George Blair gets on the phone and tells some people that the dope is there, which the DEA overheard with the wiretap.
The Gambino family had just sent Eddie and Courtney a huge load of untouched heroin from New York, and they were in the process of cutting, packing, and dispensing it to their crew when federal agents burst into the stash house.
We're gonna cut it 10 times at a minimum, so that'd have been 120 kilos. Reggie went down watching television and was watching the door. Police, then all the hell broke loose. Eddie and I runs upstairs. Eddie threw the dope up in the air. It was so strong they had to get gas masks. They had to wait to get gas masks because the fume was so strong. They got stick.
And he came out of the house with a saucer full of heroin, and he had 2 guns strapped like Roy Rogers, and had a little automatic underneath the platter of heroin. He stated something to the effects, I hope none of you EMFs are not thinking about robbing me, because I have enough arsenal up in here to start a little war up in this motherfucker.
One of Agent Sutton's targets was being guarded by a heroin messiah, a Vietnam veteran whacked out on drugs who kept a grenade in a bag around his neck as the ultimate security measure.
And this guy had a robe that was fashioned out of a sheet and had a kind of a welt belt around his waist, and he had a little tote bag in his hand, and it was under investigation by ATF. And they suspected that he had frag grenades inside of that little tote bag that he was carrying. And I had never been in such fear than when I came to Detroit. The reason the dopers were armed, they had another group out there, they called them the Jackers, which was I guess, slang for hijackers. We had people that were out there robbing dope houses and dope people.
You know, you don't have to worry about the police department or worry about getting some overdose of drugs when you go to the drug house or the dope house. You know, you got to worry about someone kicking the door in and want to stick the place out.
It was January of 1973, and somebody was robbing heroin dealers, sometimes with serious violence on the west side of Detroit. These were the Jackers, black militants who were financing the cause by ripping off dope dealers. Then they started shooting the police.
The Detroit police have an undercover program called Stress, which spelled out says stop the robberies, enjoy safe streets. Since early December, 6 of the officers have been shot, one of them fatally. The police concluded that 3 blacks were responsible for all the shootings and proceeded to launch the biggest manhunt in Detroit's history. This has led to a lot more controversy.
The furious manhunt for the 3 black suspects, door to door and often at night, stirred an angry wave of resentment in Detroit's black community and prompted the city council to air the many complaints of police misconduct. It was a bitter session, punctuated by shouts, epithets, and continuing charges of racism and police terrorism.
3 men were accused of killing the Detroit police officer while in the course of robbing drug dealers to provide money for the cause of Black Power. 2 of those men were killed in a shootout with the Atlanta police. The remaining suspect was a man named Hayward Brown.
We have, of course, been meeting regularly with our client. He understands the political nature of what is happening with reference to these motions that have been filed, is enheartened, to say the least, by the expression of support that was brought forth this morning by leading figures inside of the community, and is confident that justice will in fact triumph.
Hayward Brown's lawyer, Ken Cockrell, became famous for getting the accused cop killer off nearly scot-free, and Cockrell went on to become a member of the Detroit City Council. Hayward Brown was killed in Detroit during the mid-1980s while robbing a man for his gold chain.
But there were a lot of people, even in the Frank's organization, that were killed and executed in Philadelphia.
Philadelphia was home to some of the most violent gangsters of the era, a group christened by law enforcement as the Philly Black Mafia, and one of the most truly frightening sets of criminals from the entire era.
Philadelphia and Darby's section, they cut a drug dealer's head off and put his head on the outside window rail of a bar where drug dealers hung out.
Everyone selling drugs in Philly had to pay a tax to a group led by Ron Harvey and Sam Christian, members of Nation of Islam Temple Number 12. One of Frank Matthews' biggest customers, Tyrone Mr. Millionaire Palmer, was gunned down on Easter Sunday in an Atlantic City nightclub in a quintuple homicide that included 3 women and his bodyguard.
That was on an Easter Sunday morning. We was getting ready to leave out of there when he got killed. We had just left from that area when Fat Ty, they call him.
Despite hundreds of witnesses, no one would make a statement to the police. And Fat Ty wasn't the only Frank Matthews lieutenant killed down in Philadelphia. In the murder of an underworld figure named Major Coxon, a murder that saw his teenage stepdaughter killed alongside him, the police themselves seemed frightened.
Do you fear for his life? I fear for my own and everybody's really.
We hate ourselves.
That's right.
Because of the teaching and the training of our slave masters. Yes, sir! Who put one of us against the other.
Eventually, many of the key members of the Philly Black Mafia were convicted of a shocking crime that finally put them out of business.
Yet the quiet was shattered here at a house once owned by basketball star Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, previously known as Lou Alcindor. Police ambulances shuttled back and forth, taking away the bodies, 7 in all. 5 children ranging in age from 9 days to 11 years, and 2 adults. 4 of the children were drowned, the others shot in what may have been a feud between warring Muslim sects.
Multiple Philly Black Mafia members were convicted of murdering 7 women and small children. The victims were Sunni Muslims, whose leader was an outspoken critic of Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam.
It's been the most heinous crime that I've witnessed in my 19 years on the police department.
Basketball star Abdul-Jabbar discounted a religious war theory for the murder of his friends. I can only suspect lunatics, he said.
Does life imitate art or art imitate life? Or was there something more sinister at play in the 1960s?
Seeing people who had an admiration for the criminal element admiring crooks.
Patrolmen who work in high crime areas say part of the problem is that some people, especially among the young, admire the criminals. Drug pushers, procurers, killers are considered heroes of sorts. A slum kid may grow up thinking the quickest way to rise above the slum, to get rich, to be somebody, is to be an outlaw.
Look, we're gonna take that 300,000, we're gonna buy 30 keys of coke, man. The best shit in town, rocks and lumps as big as marbles, no cut.
How is it that the heroes of the black community went from being groups like the Black Panthers to being pimps and pushers, like Superfly and the Mac, in just a few short years?
White man comes with a gun, he's going to know the same thing can happen to him that he's going to do to the black man. He can die.
That nigga wanted the honey. All we want is the money.
But they make us dream about owning a Rolls Royce and an Eldorado, Superfly, Shaft in Harlem, Shaft in Africa, Shaft meeting with the Jew. Today, we have the movie industry saturating the black mentality with a death wish.
Eddie probably sent thousands of kids to college and paid thousands of people's mortgages and invested in and kept hundreds of African-American businesses afloat. Because let's be honest, when Chase Bank or Bank of America or Comerica isn't gonna give you that small business loan, who do you go to?
And he probably didn't even ask for it back.
And he didn't ask for it back, and he definitely didn't ask you for a credit score.
The black man want ownership. He want to be able to own his own things and make up his own mind.
When you're around other people of a certain economic level, the people don't pass judgment.
Because who knows what they're doing?
You got the jeweler down the street. He's doing all types of things. The banker is dealing with all kinds of individuals. And I'm just gonna throw it out there, people take it how they want to take it. Only poor people got the time to make moral judgments.
They dealt heroin and cocaine, and many of them trafficked like they had immunity from arrest.
A federal grand jury is looking into alleged drug payoffs within the Detroit Police Department. Today, a deputy chief, once a member of the narcotics unit, was found shot to death.
Harville, a 21-year veteran of the force, had been reportedly linked to the investigation, which centers on several police officials and one precinct.
An important piece for the puzzle of crime in America is something you don't hear about much in the mainstream media. How could whole sections of cities be turned into open-air drug markets without the police knowing about it?
It wasn't just him, he said. It was everybody.
What percentage of the plainclothesmen assigned to the division, to the 6th Division at that time, do you feel participated in the pad?
Everyone to my knowledge.
Everyone?
Everyone.
John Sutton's observation that the major dealers were running their drug business with impunity is borne out by this story about how Eddie Jackson, already under indictment for running Detroit's biggest drug ring, was caught red-handed with a large shipment of heroin and used his power over the legal system to get away scot-free.
Eddie, driving actually my mom's car, Eldorado, had a bright idea, which was completely out of the business model to do this. They had carriers whose job it was to go to New York to do these things. Call it a long night, maybe a party that went way, way too out of control. But Eddie and 5-0 decided to go to New York. They go to New York, they see the connect. When he pops the trunk, he finds the contraband. He finds the 11 bricks of heroin, the 3 bricks of cocaine. But now Eddie's got a double problem. So he's already under federal indictment for the major conspiracy case, which everybody went down on. And now he has a new case, a possession case in Pennsylvania. Well, there was a judge running for the Pennsylvania Supreme Court that our attorneys, or their attorneys, knew. Milton told Eddie, if you made a sizable contribution to this gentleman's campaign and he was to win, he guarantees us that your case will get heard by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. Eddie gives my old man, I believe it was $30,000, $40,000, which he donated to this judge's campaign. That said judge won his election to become a judge on the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. Eddie's case went to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, and it was dismissed due to an illegal search and seizure. Wow. True story.
I mean, they may be colorful, they may be glamorous, they may give turkeys on Thanksgiving, they may support a Little League baseball team, but they're selling a substance that's gonna kill your child or your grandchild.
You know, you ask yourself questions like tobacco. How many people died last year from tobacco when we started talking about the moral value of what Eddie Jackson and others do? I'm not condoning what they do. What I'm simply saying is that there are many on that playing field. And so when we demonize one group and then another group, we just kind of smile and look the other way.
There was lots of Little League sports, lots of summer camp, sailing camp, horseback riding camp. So we kind of went on vacation, sometimes 2 vacations a month. Half my family came out of the projects, you know, so of course our house and our home was a beacon of hope and just of good times. It seemed natural to us, that, to me at least, that your dad came home with duffel bags full of money every night, but beyond that, it was really not that different. It really wasn't that different.
Consensus was that drugs were in the black community and they were unmanageable. So as a consequence, nothing very much was done. And as a result, we had even law enforcement officers involved because nobody really cared.
6 weeks ago in Harlem, Black Panthers seized large quantities of heroin from drug peddlers and poured it into the street. They refused to turn it over to police because they insisted police would only resell it to the pushers.
One occasion I was dealing drugs, and they came and took all my drugs and just let me go.
Who's they?
The police.
In the summer of '73, the biggest kingpin of them all, Frank Matthews, jumped bail and fled the United States. He's never been seen since. In fact, when Clinton Shorty Buse, a well-known Baltimore native who appeared in The Wire on HBO, died several years ago, the DEA lined the route to the cemetery with Frank Matthews' wanted posters. Frank Matthews isn't the only black kingpin of his day to disappear. Eddie Jackson's original supplier in Detroit, John Klassen, also fled when indicted by the DEA and has never been found.
When the Vietnam War was in progress, there was a big availability of heroin, white heroin, heroin that was purer than the heroin that was coming in from Europe and from Mexico.
A narcotics researcher testified today that Indochina's heroin traffic is tied directly to South Vietnamese leaders and to foreign gangsters. Alfred W. McCoy, a Yale graduate student, told a Senate subcommittee that South Vietnam's heroin and opium traffic is divided between the political organizations of President Thieu, former Vice President Nguyen Cao Ky, and Premier Tran Tien Kim. In fact, said McCoy, Key's sister buys heroin in Laos, has it shipped to Cambodia, where it's picked up and flown to Saigon by planes of the Vietnamese 5th Air Division. McCoy said military leaders throughout Southeast Asia are mixed up in the illegal drug traffic, including some who work for the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency.
They were selling drugs, and they started getting customers all over the place. In my undercover work, I went up to Salt Lake City, and I learned that there were only like 250 blacks in the whole town of Salt Lake City at the time. And I worked undercover up there and found out that it was the blacks that had all of the heroin up there. Undercover agent came in out of Philadelphia, and he set up for 2 kilograms of heroin at the hotel out at LA International Airport. So we surveilled it. We thought it was a joke that a black guy was going to deliver 2 kilograms of heroin. So we see this big Cadillac drive up, and this guy jumps out like Superfly, he and another guy. 2 Mexicans pull up in a car, and we see a blonde that comes down from the room and meet with the Mexican. Then she goes upstairs and she delivers the 2 kilograms of heroin to the guys up in the room. And so we caved the door and then bust them.
These pictures were made with a special night lens in Fayetteville, North Carolina, a center for a new mob that is now competing with the American mafia. The leaders of this organization are not from New York or Chicago. They are from small towns in North Carolina.
2 major traffickers involved. One was Leslie Atkinson, and the other one was named was Herman Jackson. And reportedly, both had a club over in Thailand.
But, of course, the players come and go, but the game remains the same. Nicky Barnes was still in his prime, and down in North Carolina, a group of black ex-U.S. Army officers that federal law enforcement christened the North Carolina Mob was bringing in dope from Thailand.
This is the way much of this new mob's heroin arrives in this country, in planes like this one, an Air Force jet carrying military cargo. The genius of the North Carolina mob has been its ability to use the American military to move its heroin from Southeast Asia to this country.
Led by Leslie Ike Atkinson, these ex-soldiers were the only major black importation ring ever uncovered. Ike Atkinson alone was responsible for thousands of kilos of pure China white heroin entering America during the late 60s through the mid-70s.
Federal authorities identify this man as the head of the North Carolina mob, Leslie Ike Atkinson, Goldsboro, North Carolina, former Master Sergeant, United States Army. Atkinson is now in federal prison, but authorities believe he still runs the North Carolina mob. This is black organized crime.
Yes. In a nutshell, that's exactly what it is.
There have always been blacks in organized crime operations, but never at the top. This new mob has already staked out much of the heroin business for itself.
While black drug dealers had finally made it on their own and achieved a form of black power through their control of white powder, the black power movement was entering its late stage, becoming more esoteric and violent.
The shootings began last night around 7:30 in the Haight-Ashbury district. By 10 p.m., 4 persons lay dead, all white.
The shootings began last November, all the same pattern. White people shot down by a black gunman for no apparent reason.
The war on the streets against black drug dealers was still on, as it was the easiest source of money around. In early 1975, as the feds finished mopping up the remnants of Frank Matthews' giant drug ring, one of his old associates from North Carolina, Charles Swayze Cameron, was kidnapped for ransom in Brooklyn by black Muslims. Swayze Cameron was tortured for 3 days while waiting for his ransom to be paid. When he was released, NYPD detectives from the 77th Crown Heights precinct immediately took him in for questioning without his attorney present. These are some of his exact words.
They feel they're invincible. In Philadelphia, they killed and killed and killed until people paid up. You might think I'm a bad guy because I deal with drugs, I've sold drugs. But when you're in drugs, I don't mean, you got a network of so much information. Them so-called Muslims in Philly were squeezing really, really hard. left some nigga head in a window ledge at a bar.
The era of the Black Caesars and Superfly and the Vietnam War heroin epidemic came and went, making millionaires out of a few and destroying many other lives, just like alcohol prohibition did in the 1920s and 30s. And just like prohibition, it left an unending legacy of crime. And the drug business turned many black communities into red light districts, ruled more by the fear of murder than fear of the law.
But back in '72, I think we put away a large number of those dope dealers. And I think, had we not put them away at that time, this city would have been completely destroyed by the dopers and the murders that were taking place.
In 1977, Nicky Barnes became the most infamous black drug kingpin of all time by allowing himself to be photographed staring smugly into the camera with his nickname, Mr. Untouchable, written below.
Leroy Nicky Barnes was perhaps Harlem's and one of the country's biggest drug dealers. He sported the fur coats and fancy cars that marked his success. At 45, he was known as the Untouchable because the law couldn't seem to lay a hand on him. But today, he was sentenced to life in prison, presumably now stripped of his hero's garb in the underworld.
Hollywood made him and media made him much bigger than he really was. He was big compared to other thugs, but basically he was just one of a guy. He was the flavor of the hour, you know, for media. Nicky Barnes, Mr. Untouchable. Wow, holy shit! The fact is, he was just one of many, many times. But the Nicky Barnes case, I actually went undercover with Louis Diaz to launder money, and it was a pretty hairy moment. An after-hours joint in Harlem, and I was going to deliver the laundered cash to the Nicky Barnes organization. You give me $10 million in 10s, 1s, 5s, I'll give you back in stacks of 100. You know, you got to go up to Chez Joey. This is an after-hours club owned by Nicky Barnes. And it was intense. It was intense. I understood. This is how you die.
After receiving a life prison term, he became an informant and sent many of New York's old-time drug kings to federal prison, including the son of Jewish heroin conduit for mafia drugs, Herbie Sperling, who offered this analysis of Barnes and the government's work.
He's a girl, he's a fag, he's a punk.
So what kind of thing?
In fact, I shouldn't say he's a punk and a fag because I'm insulting punks and fags. They get somebody, they arrest him for a lot of crimes that they allege he committed. Now, the guy doesn't want to go to jail, so what does he do? He trades in 30 or 40 other people for himself so he don't go to jail. That's what Nicky Barnes did to my son.
Leroy Barnes was himself one of the most compelling characters of the era. He'd risen up from being a Harlem heroin addict in the late 50s to being the undisputed king of drugs in Harlem, courtesy of his Italian suppliers. When 60 Minutes interviewed him in the mid-'80s about his work as an informant, he gave a very insightful analysis of his own life and times in the age of white powder and black power.
I was overwhelmed by guilt. I had every reason to testify against them and no reason at all to feel guilty. But it's that street corner indoctrination, that criminal ethic, that street corner value system, it's overpowering. And I started crying on the stand.
From guilt and emotion.
And emotion. I couldn't talk.
Barnes testified about his secret 7-member drug council composed of the most successful black heroin dealers in New York. According to Barnes, they shared an oath of brotherhood and loyalty to one another.
To treat my brother as I treat myself. Mystical dynamic present when we said it.
But not everybody lost at the game. The Brown family of Detroit was permanently propelled out of the working class and into the world of businesses and real estate and the best educations money could buy.
The old man rolled the dice, Eddie, working with Eddie, and it set our family on a whole different trajectory. To be honest, it would take a calamity for us to go backwards. Education is power. The money that he made allowed our family to become a very educated family. With education, allowed us to have a whole lot of other options.
They were getting the money and they were spending their money on jewelry. They made their tailors, the car dealers, and the attorneys rich, and the bail bondsmen.
the private jewelers, all the big-time jewelers would come from all over the country and sit in our living room, you know, when I was a kid and sell the Old Man and Eddie rings and watches and special pendants and the EJ pendant. I mean, that was like $150,000 back then, so that's like, what, 1.5 million?
All we have really left is our dreams and our hopes, because the reality of those dreams coming true is about 20 to 1, because we've been deprived and exploited for so many years and lied to by the politicians. Richard Nixon, the #1, the biggest gangster in the world.
The jury is still out. We don't know what's going to happen to the African-American families that were involved with serious crime and their children.
This next generation underneath me has gone to America's best universities. They don't even have the memories of the stuff that we're talking about what the family used to be involved in. It's now just kind of urban legend.
The African-American community has quite a debt parallel to what we would consider criminal enterprise.
My great-grandmother came up from South Carolina with an 8th grade education. In 2 generations, if you're not in the top 1% of America, you've not lived the life that I've lived or seen the things that I've seen.
The Kingpins of the Superfly era had more money pass through their hands than anyone else in the African-American community's history, but this wealth didn't accrue to the wider community, unlike the profits of Italian and Jewish gangsters before them. Their profits came and went as fast as a bag of dope. The late 60s saw the rise of the drug economy, an economy that existed only because of political decisions and endemic corruption. As the low man on the economic totem pole, African Americans were and are employed as the foot soldiers of the drug business and thus bear the brunt of the casualties. To quote William Faulkner, the past isn't dead. It's not even the past. White powder, black power.
What's a
Thank you.